I'd like to officially welcome everyone to the beginning of our morning plenary program, the title of which you see on the screen. We have a few, as is inevitable at conferences, business or logistical announcements to make. Several people have inquired about internet access. As long as you are in this building, you do have access to the internet. If you look in your folders, there is a sheet of paper that on one side has a map of the Campion Student Center that shows all the different rooms on the 2 floors where we'll be meeting. There it is. Jean is holding it up. And on the reverse side, there is a page with the title Survival Kit. Sounds like we're out in the desert or something, but the very bottom paragraph gives you the password and the network, which is SJU Guest, that you can use to access the internet. So all that information is there. If you have any difficulty, I haven't heard of any. Once people get the password, they're on. So feel free to be in touch if necessary. I think you've already met, but let me reintroduce or formally introduce 2 members of the Martin Buber House staff who will be assisting us with registrations and paperwork and directions and all kinds of logistical matters. Petra Grunwald-Stangl in the back of the room, standing. And her colleague Birgit Moyer right next to her. And there are also the 3 student interns, some of whom you met last night, who will be around. So anything you need, and thank you for all your work that went into preparing the folders and the conference, please feel free to get in touch with one of them. I was also asked to announce that the friends and sponsors of the Martin Buber Foundation will be meeting this evening at 7:30, and that will be the Association of the Friends and Sponsors, and that will take place in Sunroom 2, which you'll see on your map. Ava Schultz yonder will be chairing that. There she is. Just make sure, all the other evening programs tonight will be starting at 7, but this one will be at 7:30. That's what we wanted to draw your attention to. I also wanted to apologize for the foul up with the bus yesterday evening. We have hunted down the problem in the chain of command, and hopefully that has been corrected. At least you're here this morning, so I think it has been. But we'll make sure that doesn't happen. Today is our longer day in terms of programming. We'll talk more about that as the day goes on. At this point, it gives me great pleasure to introduce the president of St. Joseph's University, Dr. Mark Reed, who will formally welcome us all to the campus in the name of St. Joseph's University. Dr. Reed, please.
Well, good morning, everybody, and I'm sorry I couldn't be with you yesterday at the official opening of this meeting, but I am glad to have a few moments here this morning just to welcome you to our campus. I can also assure you I am not one of those presidents of a university who is in love with the sound of his own voice, so this indeed will be very, very brief. About a year ago, I arrived on campus as president of St. Joseph's University, and one of the first people that I met was Phil Cunningham and his colleague Adam Gregerman. And when you meet people when you're new on a campus, sometimes you're a little suspect. Why do these people want to meet with me so quickly? What do they want to tell me? Well, as you all know, about a year ago you were in Rome and you had a particularly special audience with Pope Francis. And out of that meeting came a really historic thing here that happened at St. Joseph's University. And so I won't go into that anymore. You've heard a lot about that and are familiar with the statue just outside this building. But really that's just a way of saying that from the first days I've been on St. Joseph's University's campus, I've been well aware of the Institute of Jewish-Catholic Relations. And I want to congratulate and commend Phil and Adam and their colleagues and all of you for the work that you do and for being here. It really is a pleasure to host a conference like this. It really says that St. Joseph's University is an institution that matters. It's an institution that lives out its mission in concrete ways, and it does so with academics at the center of everything that we do. And let me just conclude by saying this, and I guess it is one piece about Francis's visit and the statue, which you've all had an opportunity to see. I get asked all the time, as you can imagine, what was it like meeting Pope Francis? Many of you in this room have done that, and it's obviously a special moment which you can all relate to. But why did he come to St. Joseph's University? And a lot of people think he came because we're a Jesuit university or because it was convenient for him because he was staying down the street when he was here in Philadelphia. And I say, well, the reality is he came because of something that we do, and something that goes back, I think, Phil, to 1967, okay, this Institute for Jewish-Catholic Relations. It embodies interreligious cooperation, dialogue, and what we are all about as a Jesuit institution and what we aspire to be. We fall short of that many times. We all fall short of things in our personal and professional lives. But the fact that you're here and the fact that we have the privilege of hosting you is certainly a testament to the fact that we never stop trying. And so thank you very much. Thank you for being here. Enjoy your time on our campus, on Hawk Hill, as we say, and enjoy the city of Philadelphia as well. Take care. Thank you.
So this morning we're really blessed to have 4 scholars from the local area who know well, inside and out, the history of the development of religious pluralism, particularly in the area of Philadelphia, but also in the United States and North America more generally. I thank all of them for sharing your expertise with us today. It's not an easy feat to, in the span of an hour and a half, talk about 400 or so years of history with multiple interweaving Christian traditions only. We're not even talking about other than Christian traditions except indirectly today. So this is not an easy task that they have agreed to take on. So all the more do we owe them our thanks. I'd like to introduce each of the panelists and then turn it over to them for helping us understand the complexity of the story that we'd like to tell. You'll note or observe from the title that although we are the International Council of Christians and Jews, and of course we have trilateral components that include Islam, clearly the majority tradition in the United States is Christianity, but don't assume that that is a monolithic reality. Christianity is subdivided into very many, sometimes quite different, religious communities whose history here has not been uniformly tranquil, shall we say. So with that in mind, let me introduce in alphabetical order Dr. David Krueger, second from my left here, is an independent scholar and educator dedicated to creating and promoting educational initiatives that foster public understanding of history and critical reflection on society. In his scholarship, he writes about American religious history, violence, myths of origin, and popular culture. He holds a THM from Princeton University, from Princeton Theological Seminary, and a PhD in religion from Temple University. His book, Myths of the Rune Stone, Viking Martyrs and the Birthplace of America, is published by the University of Minnesota Press. Over the past 10 years, he has taught at Chestnut Hill College, Palmer Theological Seminary, Temple University, and Rutgers University, Camden. He also served as an educator and community organizer with the Arch Street United Methodist Church. Dave has also kindly agreed to lead the walking tour tomorrow of early Christian sites in Philadelphia, so thank you also for that. Dr. Kate Ox, to my immediate left, my colleague here at St. Joseph's, is assistant professor in the Department of Theology and Religious Studies. She specializes in the history of Christianity. She received her PhD from Claremont Graduate University and is the producer and director of the historical content of a film produced just last year by History Making Productions called Urban Trinity, The Story of Catholic Philadelphia. And she will be showing that this evening as one of our Night at the Movies options this evening. It premiered, as I said, last September. She serves as the corresponding secretary and on the board and executive committee of the American Catholic Historical Society. She recently presented to the American Society of Church Historians a paper entitled, quote, "The only ground upon which this nation can ever enjoy divine favor, the Christian Amendment, Slavery, and Millennialism in the Reformed Presbyterian Church," end quote. You already see the diversity and richness of our panel. Dr. Terry Ray, furthest from me on the panel here, is Associate Professor of Religion at Temple University, Philadelphia, educated at universities on 4 continents, and having lived 10 years of his adult life in Zaire and Haiti, Professor Ray specializes in the anthropology and history of African and African diasporic religions. His current research projects focus on violence and religion in Central Africa and Haitian history. 2 of his recent publications are Churches and Charity in the Immigrant City, Religion, Immigration, and Civic Engagement in Miami, and Crossing the Water and Keeping the Faith. That's a great title. Haitian Religion in Miami. Dr. Ray is the 2008 recipient of the Eleanor Hofkin Award for Teaching Excellence in the College of Liberal Arts and the 2011 recipient of the Provost Award for Innovative Teaching in General Education. Dr. David Harrington Watt, third, 1 through 3 from my left, is Professor of History at Temple University, where he is also an affiliated faculty member in the Department of Religion. He received his PhD from Harvard University. Most of his articles and books focus on the history of religion in North America. In his book, A Transforming Faith, he examined the intellectual history of fundamentalism and evangelicalism in the middle decades of the 20th century. In another of his books, Bible Carrying Christians, another neat title, he uses ethnographic research to rethink the relationship between religion and social power in America during the presidency of Ronald Reagan. Along with Simon A. Wood, Dr. Watt edited a collection of original essays called Fundamentalism, Perspectives on a Contested History. Those essays analyzed what scholars lose and gain when they deploy the concept of fundamentalism to analyze the religious practices and activities of Christians, Jews, and Muslims. His latest book, Anti-Fundamentalism, an analysis of Americans' responses to the invention of religious fundamentalism, is going to be published by Cornell University Press in 2017. His current research focuses on liberal Quakers in the modern United States. As I say, if this is not a diverse panel in terms of the scope, but even then, we're only scratching the surface. We're very blessed to have all of you here. Thank you again. I will turn the podium over to my colleague, Kate Ox. Please welcome our panel.
Thank you, Phil, and thank you all for having us. And I'm honored to be on this panel as well with my colleagues from Temple University. Before we start, I would like to have us think about the intolerance in the title. You are all in the United States, those of you who are not from here, at a time that seems to be a pivotal time. And regardless of pundits and all of the noise out there, there is a moment here that I think we should all acknowledge. And as everyone in this room knows, religion has been used to justify so many atrocities and become so embedded in ideas about race, racism, And it's also a way that people see a path forward and towards a more just society and country. So if I could ask us to please just have a moment of silence for the violence that has occurred in this country over the past week especially, but beyond that as well. Thank you for that. So in our attempt to conceptualize this panel and thinking about what would be most beneficial for those of you who are not as familiar with American Protestant Christianity and American Christianity that's non-Catholic in general, what we decided to do instead of presenting 4 separate papers was to do a bit of a Q&A. And so I'm going to fill in some background, and then I'm going to turn to our presenters. As Phil noted, one of the wonderful things about this panel is that probably every question I ask could be answered by any one of the people on the panel. So sometimes I'll say, if each one of you wants to give an answer or something like that. What is also really important to me, however, is that we don't move on if something is unclear. So please feel free to jump in. We'll, of course, leave some time at the end for questions also. But, as Phil said, also, American Christianity is not a monolithic reality. And I've heard the number 12,000 in reference to the number of types of American Christianity. And that number, of course, is growing and changing all the time as well. So the other thing that I would like to, before we begin, remind us is that all of these forms of American Christianity that we're going to talk about from the past are also not static. They're dynamic. They're not frozen back there in time somewhere, but they themselves are still continuously changing. So even if we talk about something from, say, 1750 and don't pick it up again here today, you might be able to pick it up later in one of the workshops with one of us, but also just keep in mind that those forms of Christianity are still growing and changing. So, yes?
I just would have a question or a request from all of the speakers. The sound is not good in this room, number one. And number two, probably half the people here speak English as a second language. So could people speak slowly? Thank you.
Yes, and thank you for reminding us of that. I will get as close to the mic here as I can, and if I leave the podium, I'll grab a mic to take with me. So I'm going to start with Dr. Krueger with what is a potentially huge question, and that is thinking through the American Christian groups that were here. How can we connect them to 16th century European Christian occurrences, what is usually called the Protestant Reformation? So if you could sketch for us a link between, let's say, even if we want to drill down and think about it in terms of Philadelphia, but how can we connect that back to the European background before we move on and see how the denominations flourished and grew here?
Thank you very much. Please just cut me off or tell me to wrap it up if I go too long. I think it would be helpful to begin, as Kate said, in the 16th century to get a sense of perhaps 4 different strands of Protestant Christianity, just so we can have a sense of 4 different paths and how these paths grew into a number of diverse groups here in the United States and in the colonial Americas. So the Protestant Reformation, one of the key figures, of course, would be Martin Luther, a Catholic priest, who had this kind of awakening, this sense of encountering God in an individual way, of getting this new sensation that it wasn't really about the rituals that we follow, it wasn't about the traditions that we are a part of, but it's a sense of an individual encounter with God, and it's faith. This kind of intellectual faith is really what saves us. And then also John Calvin, who had a similar type of experience of this notion of local congregations have more authority and control over their own destiny, so not giving authority and deference to the church that was based in Rome. And that was part of what fueled, I think, the Protestant Reformation, particularly for Martin Luther, because it was a sense that there was an emerging sense of German speaking identity, and a sense that they wanted to have their own autonomy and in controlling their religious path. So there was a certain sense of a separation from the Roman center of Christianity. And this continued to fragment in multiple ways. So we have, on one hand, we have the Lutheran tradition as one major branch. But then we also have, as I mentioned, the Calvinist tradition as well. And a third tradition could be called the Anglican tradition. And this occurred in 16th century England, where King Henry VIII declared an independence from the Roman Catholic Church and established the Church of England. So we have Lutheran, Calvinism, Anglicanism, and then finally the fourth branch, which is often referred to as the Radical Reformation. And this movement can be embodied by folks like the Mennonites. My wife is a Mennonite, by the way, and I attend a Mennonite church. The Anabaptists, the belief that you should not be baptized as a child because you don't have any control over your knowledge of that faith. Baptism for the Anabaptist school was a sense of you had to have an understanding of what baptism meant. And more significantly, I think, for the Anabaptist strand of Christians was this notion that at the time, baptism was seen as kind of an initiation not into just a religious community, but also into a political community. So the Anabaptists said, no, we want to have control of this ritual of initiation in our local settings, in our local church communities. So many in Europe at the time viewed these radical Anabaptists as being radically subversive and not giving proper authority to the governing body. So those are roughly the four strands. In Philadelphia, the very earliest, where we have this reputation as being a Quaker town, and David's going to talk a lot about Quakers in a minute, but actually some of the first Christians who really settled in the region came from Sweden. So the first Christians came in about 1638. They were Swedish Lutherans. And even today in Pennsylvania, the oldest church in the state of Pennsylvania is actually Old Swedes Church, just in Upper South Philadelphia. After the Swedes had a reasonably successful settlement for a couple of decades, the Dutch came in, they took over control, and finally the British came and asserted their control over the region. And then the Quakers started to come with Penn, and David will talk about that. But some of the other groups, I will say this, that William Penn, as he founded this colony, he founded it as a place that would have a relatively high degree of tolerance for religious diversity. Most of the colonies at that time only had one officially recognized religion, kind of based off of a European notion of the land in which you live, that's the religion, you follow the religion of that land. So in colonial Massachusetts, for example, Puritanism, the Puritan faith, was the only established religion of the Massachusetts colony. So if you were a Quaker, you were possibly executed, you were run out of town. If you were any other dissident challenging the authority of that church, you had to escape to a colony like Rhode Island to be able to get away from that. Virginia was a colony that had the established religion of Anglicanism from the Church of England. And if you were especially in the late 18th century, if you were a Baptist preacher preaching your own message, you risked imprisonment in a place like Virginia. So that was the typical pattern of colonial religion, was that there was an established official religion in your colony, but Penn's colony was different because there were many, many groups that came here. Just real quickly, some of the earliest groups, of course, being that it was a British colony, the Church of England had a very early presence here in Philadelphia through Christ Church. If you go on my walking tour tomorrow, we'll stop by Christ Church. And even though in the 1680s, 1690s, the Quakers were, some of the numerically very strong presence, there were Anglicans there as well. And one of the stories I'll probably tell at the church tomorrow is there was a certain anxiety among the Anglicans and a certain frustration that they were not the established, most powerful church in the city. They had to be in an environment where they had to compete for a religious adherence from a wide variety of traditions. And if you go into Christ Church, you'll find, very interestingly, the baptismal font of William Penn, the Quaker, because William Penn in his younger days was baptized in an Anglican church. So this Christ Church brought this baptismal font to the church, and I would argue, as a certain sense of reminding this Quaker town that Penn was originally Anglican, and you all ought to return, you Quakers ought to return to the fold, so to speak. I think that's kind of an interesting notion. There were Presbyterians, Scots-Irish immigrants who came to Philadelphia as well. They grew rather rapidly, and by the 1740s, they were numerically a bigger group than even the Quakers by the mid-18th century. You had Baptists that showed up here. You had German Reformed folks that showed up. There's a settlement called Germantown in Philadelphia where a number of German-speaking immigrants settled. So you had folks like Mennonites. You had German-speaking Quakers that were meeting up there. You had a pietist sect known as the Johannes Kelpius Women in the Wilderness, where they founded a colony in the woods of the Wissahickon Valley, and they came to Penn's colony because they expected that Jesus Christ would return to Philadelphia in the year 1700, and they came to the woods of outside of Philadelphia to wait, and they built a building to observe the stars, looking for signs that Jesus would one day return. So there was a wildly diverse place here in Philadelphia in the very early decades of white settlement of the area. Again, very unique from other colonies. Roger Williams, Rhode Island might be another equivalent, but that emerged out of a necessity of dissidents escaping Massachusetts. But Penn's colony was unique because it was diversity by design, which I think is really fascinating to me.
Thank you. That was probably the toughest question anyone has ever asked anyone. And so thank you for a great answer and for drilling down to Philadelphia as well and keeping that on our minds, as well as the competition. And a lot of scholars look to the notion of competition and all of these different denominations and groups competing with one another for bodies, for souls, as part and parcel of the diversity, the wild diversity, as Dave said. My next question I would like to ask Dr. Ray. So we just heard about some folks who had come here from Europe. Who else was here in Philadelphia and in the colonies that was not from Europe and that was a group that was highly influential on American religious development?
Thank you. A very good question. Can you hear me? Yeah. Also, willkommen nach Philadelphia. Ich möchte gerne auf Deutsch sprechen, aber leider ist mein Deutsch sehr schlecht geworden, since I was once a student in Tübingen. And in Tübingen, I learned that it's a difficult place to learn German because I could not distinguish between Schwäbisch and German. So I am pleased to be here, and I'm grateful for the invitation. And I am out of my league. I must say I'm not an Americanist, although I do have 2 books on Miami. Miami can hardly be considered a typical place in America. It is a city where more than half of the population is born in other countries, and more than half the population does not speak English as the language of the household. So Miami is quite different from Philadelphia. My own arrival in Philadelphia was one tied to slavery. In fact, I am a historian of African religions and an anthropologist of Caribbean religions. I lived in Africa for a long time. I lived in the Caribbean for a long time. And when I came to Philadelphia, I was soon appointed chairperson of our department. And at the time, we had a new class called Religion in Philadelphia. No one was teaching it, and when you're the chair of a department, you're concerned about things like enrollments. So I decided to teach it. The timing was quite interesting because I just finished a book manuscript about a transgendered prophet in the Haitian Revolution who called himself the Virgin Mary's God's son, although he gave himself the name prophetess. And his story is one of violence against slavery. And he was very instrumental during the first year of the Haitian Revolution. What does this have to do with Philadelphia? Everything, because Philadelphia was a nodal point of the transatlantic slave trade. So to get to the point in a moment, how did this book project bring me to Philadelphia? There was a Catholic priest, a secular priest, named Félix Pascalis Ouvière. He was from Aix-en-Provence. He winds up in Saint-Domingue in Haiti in 1791. He doesn't have a job, but he becomes the political advisor to this transgendered Catholic prophet, a black man. And it all blows up. The French priest becomes a refugee. He has to flee. He goes to Paris, but he's outed as a royalist. This is 1791, 1792 in Paris. He's a royalist. He's a Catholic priest. Where is he going to go? Philadelphia, which at the time had a French-speaking population of roughly 8% of the city. So the French population was thriving, as was the German population. So who were some of the other first people to step foot in this part of the world? Prior to the arrival of Europeans, of course, there were the Lenape Native Americans, and William Penn. He had envisioned a relationship with them that could have been harmonious, but that all fell apart rather quickly, and their land was taken, and they were displaced. Others to arrive here as early as 1639 were Africans. The first slave in the Delaware Valley was brought here in 1639. And I actually thought that I was going to have to read a paper this morning, so I wrote one. And I'd just like to read a couple of paragraphs from that paper, if I may. And I'll make it a point to read it slowly. And if anyone would be interested, I'd be happy to email it to you, should you like to read it. Although religions have a long and rich history in colonial America and the United States, beginning with the worldviews and spiritual practices of the first enslaved Africans brought to Virginia in 1619. Within 20 years, Dutch and Swedish settlers had imported African slaves to labor in the Delaware Valley, while later that century, Pennsylvania was established as an English colony by William Penn, who was himself a slave owner. Founded in 1682 as what Penn envisioned as a holy experiment built on Quaker principles of human equality and religious tolerance insofar as you were whites and Protestant and not Jewish or Catholic or black. So the tolerance only extended so far, as it were. Built on Quaker principle, I just read that. Within 2 years, Philadelphia was home to roughly 200 enslaved Africans, and by 1710, 20% of the population of this city was enslaved and African. One of the questions that intrigues me as an historian, and I knew nothing about Philadelphia's religious history till I had to write about this priest who shows up here, and he shows up here during the yellow fever epidemic of 1793, which I'm sure Dave will talk about tomorrow on the tour. And this Catholic priest is also a physician, and he begins treating patients, so he has this remarkable career here. But one of the questions I could not find an answer to when I was reading about Philadelphia's religious history is this. What was black religion like in Philadelphia prior to Richard Allen and Absalom Jones? Richard Allen founds the first African independent congregation, the African Methodist Episcopal Church, here in Philadelphia. Their convention is taking place right now in Philadelphia as well, so there are AME members from all over the world who are in Philadelphia as we speak. But there were black people here as early as 1639, and yet the only research that's ever been done about black religion is done about Richard Allen and his church, and that is a very important topic, and I will speak about that in my workshop later today. But what about black religion prior to the emergence of the AME church? And that question is difficult to answer, but I have some ideas that I'd like to share with you. And please stop me if I go on too long, because those of us with the word profess in our job titles sometimes profess, right? There is little archaeological evidence of African religion in the city during the colonial era, yet one can glean its presence and growth from a complaint made by the Philadelphia Council in 1693, and I quote, "of the tumultuous gathering of the Negroes in the town of Philadelphia on the first days of the week." The council might well have been referring to communal African rituals in Southeast Square, which is today's Washington Square Park, located at 6th and Walnut near Independence Hall, which was colloquially known in the 18th century as Congo Square. And when you go to Washington Square Park, perhaps you will tomorrow, there is a large black, ironically, statue of George Washington, who owned several hundred slaves. And there is a tomb of an unknown soldier, an eternal flame, and it is right behind Independence Hall. And as you walk around this park, there's a little plaque, a very small plaque, that says, and I stopped dead because I didn't know this, and I practically grew up here. There's a little plaque that says, "This used to be called Congo Square," right? Why Congo Square? Because Africans performed drumming rituals in this square, and they buried their dead there. And for those of you who know anything about African religion, ancestral veneration is very important. You venerate the dead at the burial site. So Congo Square was sacred space to Africans. And I will add this, that although we don't know the distinct ethnicity of Africans in colonial Philadelphia, it is safe to say that most of them were Fon, Yoruba, Congo, and Ashanti. Those were the largest enslaved African ethnic groups brought to South Carolina. And we know a great deal about their religion, so you can begin to envision what this religion looked like. But one final point I'd like to make is this, that among these Africans who were enslaved and brought to Philadelphia in the 17th century were the first Catholics in the Delaware Valley. This university is a Jesuit university. There's remarkable displays in the Student Center about Jesuit history and Jesuit history in Philadelphia, and that is all wonderful. I mean, 1730, this was the only place in this part of the world where you could attend Mass without the threat of being persecuted, right? In 1730, and you'll be visiting that church tomorrow, I would imagine. But prior to that, the Kingdom of the Congo was visited by Portuguese missionaries at the end of the 15th century, and the Kingdom of the Congo embraces Catholicism, such that African slaves taken from the Congo in the middle of the 17th century were Catholics. So the first Catholics brought here were Congolese Catholics, and it's a heritage that I hope to research, and I hope to do some writing about this topic because no one else has. So the first Catholics in Philadelphia were Africans, and among those Africans, some of them probably played really beautiful music in Congo Square, and I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Thank you. Another tremendously large question and fantastic answer. And so I hope we're really starting to see all of these layers and hybridities and combinations and this wild diversity. But now let's think about this Quaker ideal. If the city is founded by William Penn, a Quaker, what does that mean relative to having all of these other groups here? And for that answer, I'm going to turn to Dr. Watt, please.
So Quakerism is conventionally dated as beginning in 1652 in England. It was a time of tremendous social, political, and religious upheaval, comparable to Israel-Palestine in the 1940s, comparable to Germany in the 20s and 30s. It's almost impossible to exaggerate how exciting and how scared people were. Quakers believed in a strong sense that they were Christ reincarnate, and they performed miracles in George Fox visited America, and according to George Fox, not far from here, he raised someone from the dead. Well, many non-Quakers were, understandably, horrified by people like George Fox and Margaret Fell and James Naylor. It's not going too far to say that someone like James Naylor, one of the most important early Quaker leaders, was viewed with the same kind of horror that Osama bin Laden has been viewed. So, in 1660, everything changes in this time of revolutionary experiment, a time when a king had been executed, comes to an end, and a kind of order is reimposed. Now, there were literally hundreds of radical groups in England in the 1600s, the kind of Anabaptist, related to the kind of Anabaptist that Dave started this off with. And almost all of those groups are gone. Like most of the sects associated with the radical Reformation in England and in the continent are gone. The Quakers did what they needed to survive. And they still kept a lot of radical ideas, but they did at least two things to convince the king and his advisors that they were not dangerous. The first is they said, in a way that they had never said as clearly before, we don't believe in violence. We're not going to try to use violence to bring about the kingdom of God. And this was partly a strategic move. And this becomes one of the defining characteristics of Quakers post-1660. Often it takes the form of a kind of absolute nonviolence. Well, it's kind of a crazy thing to create a state based on nonviolence. and actually, the tension of Quakers trying to rule Philadelphia without using violence to prop up the property of the institution of slavery or the taking of land from Native Americans. So anyway, there's this fundamental contradiction right at the heart of the founding of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. It's founded by people who are deeply anti-hierarchical, who are formally embraced or formally eschewed the use of violence. And then the second thing is, in 1660, again, just trying to survive, the Quakers embraced the concept of religious toleration. And they did not do that in the beginnings. In the beginnings, they viewed a world where everyone had become a Quaker. Everyone had become a true Christian, including the Muslims. The Muslims were going to become true Christians. But as it became clear that they weren't going to win, history wasn't going the way they thought it was going to go. People weren't recognizing them as embodiments of Christ. They decided the best they can hope for, and again, it's kind of a strategic move, is just that everyone be tolerated. And actually, in the 1660s, Quakers closely cooperated with Catholics in England because Quakers thought that if Catholics could be tolerated, so could Quakers. Right? So again, I want to emphasize the embrace of religious toleration, like the embrace of nonviolence, was partly strategic, but then it becomes one of the defining characteristics of Quakerism, and Quakerism, Pennsylvania is founded on this formal ideology of religious toleration is a good thing. And in fact, William Penn, who was also kind of a real estate developer, sent his agents throughout continental Europe trying to find oppressed people, saying, is your magistrate persecuting you? Well, you can leave the Rhineland and you can come to Pennsylvania, and I promise you, you won't be persecuted. So nonviolence and toleration were in some ways simply accidents, but then they got, as it were, inserted into the DNA of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. And it created a mess which we have not yet solved.
Thank you. I like very much that idea of it being in the DNA of the Commonwealth. But back to the mess a little bit. So I want to leap us forward to the 19th century and pick up on this contradiction between these founding ideals and what's happening on the ground in Philadelphia as diversity continues to increase and as more people with different religious backgrounds, either Protestant, Catholic, Jewish, Muslim, are arriving here. So if we could leap forward to the 19th century, and Dr. Krueger, can we start with you in thinking about perhaps a conflict that you think is indicative of what was going on? And I'm going to ask a really similar question to each of you. Just what kind of tension in 19th century Philadelphia provides a good lens for what is happening between religious communities?
The early 19th century, we didn't talk too much about the 18th century. There was a movement called the First Great Awakening. It was kind of a evangelical revival that took place throughout the colonies, but also took place in Philadelphia as well. And there was this upsurge of Protestant religious fervor and kind of seeking to reform or to reinvigorate the so-called kind of dominant mainline churches. But that revival kind of lost its fervor towards the end of the 18th century, towards 1800. But then after the American Revolution, and as the new nation was spreading westward, as white immigrant settlers, many of them moved across the Appalachian Mountains and moved into the frontier, there was a great deal of new energy that was unleashed for religious entrepreneurs, especially folks that were the Methodists and the Baptists. They instigated a kind of a religious revival that took place during that time period where Protestant churches grew in great amounts. So that really was the golden age in the United States history, this period of the first 3, 4, or 5 decades of the 19th century. That was the golden age of Protestant evangelical Christianity. And as I'll be talking about in my workshop a little bit later, this was the era where folks began to think of the United States as a distinctly Christian nation. But when they said Christian, they were actually referring to a particular kind of Christian, being Protestant Christianity. So numerically, the immigrant groups, the folks from Europe who came to the colonies and then to the early nation, many of them came from Protestant areas, from England. And there were many German immigrants as well, and many of them were obviously with Lutheran or Reformed or Pietist type of movements, but they were all Protestant. But the numbers began to change quite dramatically during the 1830s and 1840s, where the next large wave of immigrants started to come from Ireland due to severe famines, due to a potato blight that left many Irish people living in abject poverty and suffering, and many of them chose to come to the new nation. So they came in large numbers in the 1830s, and of course they were Catholic. So as this new immigrant group began to come to a city like Philadelphia, the Protestants began to grow a bit concerned, because these new Catholics, as they came to the country, there was a question of where exactly their allegiances were held. Were these new Irish Catholic immigrants going to be loyal to the President of the United States, to the national American project, or were they still holding or giving deference to that papist, that Pope in Rome that was from another part of Europe? So the question was, could Catholics really become Americans in cities like Philadelphia? So as the numbers began to increase rapidly in the 1830s and 40s, tensions arose. There was one incident where there was a rumor that at the time the Protestant Bible, the King James Bible, was read in the public schools in the city. And there was a concern among Catholic parents that their Catholic children were being subjected to the education of Protestant ministers and a Protestant way of reading Scripture and approaching religion. So there was some talk about Catholics, students having the option to read from the Catholic Bible. Well, the rumors started to spring up that Catholics were trying to remove the Protestant Bible from the classrooms, and some nativist Protestant leaders, many of affiliated with what was called the Know Nothing Party of the mid-19th century, they made their way up into the Catholic neighborhoods just north of the center part of Philadelphia, and they started protesting. And by the end of the summer, and two separate incidents, I think like 25 persons were killed in the streets of Philadelphia. And two Catholic churches were burned to the ground. A Catholic library was destroyed. And I think one juxtaposition is very interesting, in which, if you come on my tour, I'll show you tomorrow. There was a Methodist church right across the street from St. Augustine's Catholic Church. And the Catholic Church was burned to the ground in the summer of 1844. But what's interesting is, in the Methodist Church archives of historic St. George's Methodist Episcopal Church, there is no record of this Catholic church being burned down at that location, which strikes me as a little bit fishy. That's a little bit strange. Why wouldn't the most significant event that ever happened in your neighborhood be recorded? I think there was a certain level of perhaps Protestant shame and perhaps Protestant complicity. I'm a United Methodist now, and hopefully there weren't United Methodists out there lighting the flames to burn down this Catholic church, but it's very possible that they were.
What do you mean possible?
It could have been some Quakers. It could have been the Anglicans. Don't blame the Methodists. It was a very religiously tense time. There were racial riots during this time as well, but that's another topic.
Thank you. Lots of stuff to take in this morning. I want to go back to St. George's, however, in my question to Dr. Ray, and in this, again, increasing religious diversity and tensions and conflicts, but also perhaps the creative responses to them that emerge here in Philadelphia. So perhaps we could talk about something that occurred at St. George's.
Right. St. George's Methodist Church is the cradle of Methodism in Philadelphia, and in the 18th century, it's the second half of the 18th century, there were African Americans who were members of this church, and yet they were forced to worship from on the balcony on high, so the seating was segregated by race. And at one point in time, when they were on the ground floor worshiping, they were told to get up off their knees, and they walked out in mass. And this protest was led by Richard Allen and Absalom Jones. And I'll focus on those two heroes in my workshop later in the day. I want to talk about movies instead, and some of you might like Harrison Ford. Anyone? Harrison Ford? So when I think of religious diversity in Philadelphia, I have all these remarkable images that come to mind, and I take my students all over the city to share with them what is quite unique about this city in terms of its religious diversity and heritage. In the film The Witness, there's a wonderful scene where Harrison Ford is an undercover Amish Christian, and there's this little boy in 30th Street Station, this little Jewish boy in 30th Street Station, and he sees an Amish man coming up the stairs with this big black hat and long beard, and he thinks it's his grandfather, when in reality it's not a Jew at all, it's an Amish guy. And also, I have the idea for a book project that I will probably never write because I find history to be extremely difficult to do. I'm much better at ethnography. Most of my work is actually anthropology. But I have an idea for a book project, and I'd like to hear what my true Americanist colleagues think of this. But I think that America's entire religious history can be told simply by taking a ride up 5th Street from the very south end of the city of Philadelphia. It is 18.8 miles long, 5th Street, and it runs through the heart of the oldest part of the city. But you also see more recent neighborhoods emerging, like Northern Liberties. You go further north, and also on 5th Street, part of the Underground Railroad went up 5th Street, which were stations of homes, of taverns, of churches, where escaped slaves from the South could find refuge and making their way further north. And Philadelphia, this is quite significant, is the southernmost northern city during the early American history. So if you are a slave escaping slavery in the South, this would be the first place many would arrive. So that's part of the 5th Street story. But on 5th Street is founded, Mother Bethel AME Church is actually found in a home on 5th Street. So that is part of the story as well. And as you go north, you get out of Center City, the historical part of the city, what I like to call Philadelphia's Disneyland. It's like the Epcot Center of Philadelphia. You get further north, and you'll suddenly notice that the maintenance of the streets is non-existent. There is garbage everywhere. The sidewalks are broken. There is graffiti. You are no longer in Disneyland. You are in North Philadelphia, where we teach. And this is what is called a ghetto, and it is abandoned by the state. One of the most important books written about religion in Philadelphia is actually written not by an American, but by an Israeli named Ram Knan, and he teaches at the University of Pennsylvania. And in the introduction to that book, he said he was shocked when he moved to the United States of America to see how little the state does for its people, especially in places like North Philadelphia. And this is when he came to realize how vital the important religion is, because religion fills this vacuum of need. But as you go north on 5th Street, you go near Temple University, there are a lot of African-American storefront churches. A little further north, and you are in El Centro de Oro, which is the Puerto Rican barrio neighborhood, and there are a lot of Spanish-speaking Pentecostal churches. You go a little further north, and you are in a heavily Caribbean neighborhood where you will find a voodoo temple. You will find Rastafarians, and you will find Muslims from Senegal on North 5th Street as well. So I'm telling you this story just to tell you, if I do write this book, what the cover is going to look like, right? And I probably won't write it because, again, I'm intimidated by writing history. It's just too hard. So hopefully I'll have a doctoral student who will come to Temple and say, what should I write my dissertation on? I say, here you go. This is a project. I know David has given projects to some students in the past. I have one of my students right now writing the first biography of Absalom Jones, right? We have 2 excellent biographies of Richard Allen, not one on Absalom Jones, which is astonishing when you consider that this man is a saint on the Episcopal liturgical calendar. He is a saint, the first American saint, really. Yeah. So the cover. At 5th Street, around Indiana, Cambria, this might mean nothing to you at the moment, but in the heart of a very challenged neighborhood on 5th Street is one of my favorite botanicas, and I prepared a short paper on botanicas. A botanica is a religious goods store that caters to people who practice Santeria and Voodoo, and these are the religions that I really study. But near the oldest botanica in Philadelphia, it is called Maria Arte Espiritual, the Maria's Spiritual Arts, is a church. And this church will be on the cover of the book that I will never write, but I think the church speaks volumes about religious change, religious diversity. It's a beautiful, fairly large stone church built in the 19th century, and in the facade, in the stone, beautiful masonry, is inscribed Deutsches Evangelische Kirche, right? And below this is a large plastic sign that says Templo Arco de Salvación. This is now a Puerto Rican Pentecostal church, and at one point in time, it was a thriving German church, a German Protestant church. A little further north on Erie, there's another large church. It's a German Lutheran church with German in the facade. And one final observation. A couple of years ago, the secretary in our department gave me a box of papers. Said, these belong to Professor Stoeffler. Would you like to look through them? Professor Ernest Stoeffler was a theologian and church historian who founded our Department of Religion. And I'm looking through his papers, and he died in 1990 or so. And he was a distinguished scholar. He wrote a great deal about German pietism, a wonderful book about German pietists in Pennsylvania, in fact. And in this collection of papers, I found 40 sermons, because he was a Methodist reverend. And these sermons are beautiful. They're typed on a typewriter. Remember those things? The typewriter. And the sermons are often tied to correspondence, because he preached in various Methodist churches throughout the area, and he saved all this correspondence. And it is so Germanly orderly. It's all like organized. And I came to realize that he was the pastor of a German-speaking Methodist church on Girard Avenue in North Philadelphia well into the 1950s, right? That was surprising to me. I would have thought that the German-speaking churches went out of existence when Germans left the city, but as of the 1950s, there was still a German Methodist church on Girard Avenue. So I don't know what the point is, but, the photograph, right. So Deutsches Evangelische Kirche, Templo Arco de Salvación, right near the Botanica Maria Arte Espiritual.
Thank you. And I was wishing that I had a pointer so that I could be showing you on the map the places that Dr. Ray was talking about. But 5th Street is right about here. He's talking about way up north. I think that the Buddhist temple is on 5th and Shunk, also down in South Philly. It's on 5th, I believe. 5th or 6th.
Yes, that's right. Also, there's a Moorish Science Temple on 5th Street, which is one of the earliest forms of Islam. Islam comes to this country among Africans, right? Enslaved Africans, many of them were Muslims. And there's a reform movement in American Islam called the Moorish Science Temple. They have their location on 5th Street. And I live near the northern limit of 5th Street. 5th Street ends at Cheltenham Avenue. And the northernmost church is actually the Ukrainian Orthodox Cathedral, which is up there too, quite a beautiful church. Looks like a spaceship.
I happen to have a Moorish Science Temple picture for what I'm going to be talking about in the workshop, so I'll get a chance to see it here. I want to go back just a little bit and talk about what I alluded to when we opened, which is the use of religion, the use of scripture to justify slavery and the slave trade, as well as the use of religious beliefs and scripture to justify abolition. And in Philadelphia, we had the earliest groups that were formed, organizations that were formed for abolition. So, Dr. Watt, could you tell us a bit about how that fits in with Quaker ideology and how both abolition and those who were pro-slavery were in Philadelphia simultaneously, and how that played out?
First, I'll say a little bit about Quakers, and then I'll pull back a little bit. So, as far as I know, the first group of white Christians that formally opposed chattel slavery as saying it is an immoral institution were Quakers. They did so in something called the Germantown Petition, which was written in 1688, drawn up by, I believe, 4 German-speaking Quakers. This document is still in existence. It's kept a couple of miles from here at Haverford College. If you just drive a little west, you can see this, which is really kind of an important document in the history of the West.
And excuse me one second, I did bring a number of copies of it, actually,
Oh, really?
if anyone would like one. Yeah.
Let's see. It took Quakers forever to unite behind the idea that you could not be a member of the Religious Society of Friends. That's the formal word for the organization that Quakers belong to. The petition is 1688. It's really well over a century before Quakers have united in the belief that you cannot be a member in good standing of the Religious Society of Friends while owning slaves. But eventually they do come to that, and Quakers were so deeply committed to anti-slavery that a number of them did take up arms in the American Civil War. So given a choice between clinging to nonviolence or embracing violence in order to overcome chattel slavery, they joined up. Taking a step back. Taking a step forward. So I live not far from here, on the other side of the Schuylkill, and most days I go for a walk with my dog on something called the Laurel Hill Cemetery, which is a beautiful hill. You might actually be able to see it from here. Anyway, she and I go for a walk there almost every day. She's very shy. She's actually afraid of living human beings. She finds dead human beings much more comfortable to be around. Sometimes I feel the same. But anyway, almost every day we go there, and almost every day I see United States flags planted in the graves of veterans who fought for the United States of America, and I see Confederate flags. So the Confederate flag, is a stars and bars, red, blue, white. There is a group called the Sons of the Confederacy that goes around and plants flags commemorating the men who died defending the Confederacy. And some of them are buried here in Philadelphia, because as Terry noted, we're so close to the American South. Well, if you go to the website of the Sons of the Confederacy, you will see an explanation that those men died for all the best of America. They died for Christianity, for purity, for honor. This is the ideology of the Confederate States of America, of the Sons of the Confederate States. Well, it's clear that the Confederacy was founded for one primary reason, and that was to protect the institution of chattel slavery. Right? So what I'm trying to say is this: the way we remember the American Civil War is still being fought today. And I've tried having a long series of conversations with the people who run the cemetery, explaining why I don't think it's such a great idea to, in a predominantly African American part of town, to have Confederate States flags flying. I've gotten nowhere. I've now resorted to direct action. So as my dog and I are walking along, just pick up the flags and put them down. What's a little hard to remember is that it's not just the Northerners who thought that the Civil War was a religious crusade on behalf of the Christian gospel. The Southerners thought so, and thought so too. And if anything, thought so more. The Confederate States of America was committed to being a Christian institution, even more fully than the United States of America was. And you know, the conflicts over chattel slavery were largely fought out at first with Protestants quoting Bible verses back and forth at each other. Slaves, be subject to your masters. In Christ there is neither slave nor free. Just one more word and then I'll shut up. And Terry was reminding me of this earlier, just a few minutes ago. Part of what slavery did in the United States was create the need to justify slavery, and that was done largely by creating the ideology of white supremacy and racism. And even after slavery was formally abolished, the legacy of white supremacy and racism lived on. So I grew up in a place where there were different restrooms for colored people, which is what the sign said, than there were for white people. And there were different water fountains. And there were different schools. So I went to god-awful schools in the state of Alabama. I can't tell you how bad they were, but we had books, you know? And the schools next to me did not, right? So this religious debate over whether or not a Christian should own slaves is a question which is not as dead as it might be.
I'd like to stay with this idea as we wrap up. And if I could ask each of the panelists, and perhaps all of us, to think about this, and think about the ways that, especially because we're talking about American Christian communities, Protestant primarily, but also Latter-day Saints perhaps we might want to talk about, but thinking about how religion and racial ideologies are intertwined and how we get from that 19th century, either in Philadelphia or in the country or in the region in the South, to today, and how we see these things that began to be intertwined in terms of, as Dr. Watt said, folks using different scriptural passages back and forth to one another, but how these racial ideologies were shot through with religion and vice versa, and how that takes us to where we are today. Another really big question, but if you have perhaps a thread to think about, and the complicated question, there'll be complicated answers, probably more questions than answers, certainly. But if you could help us draw some lines there.
How much time do
We have 10:30. We stop, right?
Well,
And a little time for questions. So,
maybe 7.
and if I know I'm sort of putting everybody on the spot here. So if anyone has an answer that they're ready to think about with us all, and also realizing that this is not over. So the questions are really what is proliferating, I think, right now.
Take a quick stab at it. Yeah. I would imagine that you've been observing, perhaps before you came here to the U.S., you may have been watching a little bit about our presidential election. It's been a really tense several months. And if you listen very carefully to the rhetoric and the language of two politicians that stand out to me, you may or may not have heard of Ted Cruz. He was one of a very strong candidate. He dropped out a few months ago. But Ted Cruz, for example, every speech that he gave, he would say something to the effect of, "We need to return America to its Judeo-Christian values upon which it was founded." So he clearly was signaling to his audience, trying to connect with his audience of this sense of where America is today is not where we want to be, because there are things lurking around that are not Judeo and Christian. So clearly a call back to a more Christian past. And there's another political candidate whom I think you may have heard of named Donald Trump. One of his refrains again and again, and you've seen the little red hats with the white writing that says, "Make America Great Again." Again, these are both historical claims to call us back to an imagined past that was, for Cruz, to a certain extent, more Christian, more along his imagined religious orientation, whereas for Trump, it's a little bit more skewed towards this notion of a whiter America past. So, and even both candidates, certainly religion and race are tied together because Trump and Cruz both talked about limiting Muslim immigration to the U.S. And I think there's both a racial and a religious dimension to that. So I just keep thinking about the rhetoric that has been unleashed in the last few months that has been getting such coverage. It's deeply disturbing.
Thank you.
Well, I have a brilliant description of the problem, and I have a solution, but I think we're just about out of time now, so I'm sorry. No, I'll just end it this way. I'm going to talk about the American Revolution. We Quakers, for the most part, experienced the American Revolution as a catastrophe and a disaster, and some of us were hanged for not supporting it avidly enough. So we joke about this, but we do kind of say this whole United States of America thing, from a Quaker's perspective, it's kind of a dangerous recent experiment, you know. But we are quite suspicious of the whole enterprise. Of course, that's a distinct minority. So I would say if you put yourself in the United States in 1800, most citizens of the United States believed that America was a white Christian nation and that God had chosen this white Christian nation, really a white Christian Protestant nation, and God had chosen this white Christian Protestant nation to spread his truth and freedom throughout the world. And I think a sizable percentage of the American people believe that today. From my perspective, it's hard to imagine a more dangerous ideology.
Bye.
All right, quickly then. There's a very interesting, controversial article written by a French sociologist named Loïc Vacan, in which he argues that after slavery, white people in America invented Jim Crow legislation to control black people and to keep them suppressed. After that, the ghetto, and after that, the industrial prison complex. 1 out of 3 black people in this nation is in the penal system, is a record, or is in prison, incarcerated. And with that often comes disenfranchisement. If you're convicted of a felony, you lose your right to vote, right? So I'm not sure that I agree entirely with Vacan, but it is food for thought. I grew up Catholic in New Jersey, and when I was 16, I'm 53 now, and when I was 15 years old, I thought that when I grew up, I wanted to do something righteous. And my understanding of doing something righteous as a young American in the 1970s in New Jersey was to join the army and kill Russians because they're evil, because they don't believe in God, right? So we are indoctrinated, every one of us. I mean, we're socialized, and you reach a point in life where you never question these things until you have the good fortune of reading Karl Marx, or actually meeting communists and finding that they're really nice people. I was shocked when I first met a communist who was a lovely guy, right? He didn't believe in God, but he was still a lovely guy, and I no longer wanted to kill them, right? But with knowledge comes responsibility, and this is one of the things that I cherish as a university professor, is to speak with and dialogue with young Americans. And at Temple University, we have students from all over the world, so young minds from all over the world, and help them grapple with some of their own biases of which they are perhaps unaware, right? This summer, in fact, I had a course at Temple, 15 students, only 5 were Americans, and there were 10 Muslims in the class, 1 Chinese atheist, and a couple of people from New Jersey. So, right. I suppose that about says it. But just there are so many places in this country that are deeply broken. And when David Bowie, may his soul rest in peace, David Bowie, anyone? No? When David Bowie first came to America to tour before he released Aladdin Sane, he went to Detroit and he asked to be taken to African-American neighborhoods, and he was shocked, right? He was shocked. He said, "My God, these places are real, and people actually live in them." So,
thank you all. I know that was another really, really big question, and I just think you all did a tremendous job of linking religion and race, manifest destiny, American exceptionalism, imperialism, ideas about the other, and ideas about how American ideology should spread with all of its religious and racial connotations and explicit ideologies. So I hope that we have helped you think about the diversity of American Christianity, and I would like to take any questions that you might have right now, things that we could help clarify, or questions that you have in general. So we have time for a few. Yeah.
My name is Sylvia Deutsch. I'm a sister of Our Lady of Zion, and I live in Brooklyn, New York, in a place called Flatbush. And so it's one of the largest Haitian diaspora communities in the world. And it's also home to Muslims from Central Asia and South Asia and Turkey. And it's home to a lot of Latino people, especially Mexican people and the Caribbean. And one of the things I've learned living there is how much it's not simply a question of, in this case, Catholicism in the United States, or Judaism in the United States, or Islam in the United States. But in each of these communities, there's an enormous range of social class and economic class and education. And in each of these communities, there's also wide ethnic difference. I mean, Latino people are many kinds of Latino people. And the same thing with Muslim people. There are many kinds of Muslim people and many kinds of South Asian Muslim people. And so I would like to know, and especially in terms of the work we're doing here, just a few thoughts about how the reality of immigration and class is impacting the questions of our religious identity. And I'm thinking about this country, but I think many of our countries are experiencing these complicating and challenging and very rich prospects.
Yeah. Perhaps Dr. Watt was suggesting perhaps that is a comment, because you're absolutely correct. The only one point that I was thinking as you were talking about Philadelphia and the distinctions between Philadelphia and some of the noise and things that people from outside the states might be thinking about the states, is that we are a sanctuary city. And so that is in distinction to those who are aggressively anti-immigrant. But we have all of those class and national and language distinctions with all the communities that you mentioned here. Does anyone want to add to that?
Thanks for the question. I have a Haitian father-in-law who lives in Flatbush and a Haitian mother-in-law who lives in Flatbush, and she's a voodoo priestess, and she makes most of her money selling numbers for the lottery to Dominicans. In 1974, 76, a sociologist named Timothy Smith wrote a very influential article in which he makes the claim that the immigration experience is itself a theologizing experience. That's people who immigrate find that experience in itself to be almost this burdenous prophetic experience in which they are challenged and they rely upon their faith to see them through. It is an extraordinary struggle. And if you work with immigrants, the stories that you hear are extraordinary. I mean, listen to a woman who walked here from Honduras twice, and she made it here by pretending to be a Seventh-day Adventist, because throughout Mexico, Seventh-day Adventist churches will harbor immigrants coming from Guatemala, El Salvador, and Central America and help them get to Texas. So she pretended she was an Adventist till she got to Texas, and then she became Catholic again. But one of the striking things in the study of religion and immigration in America is this, that religion is the most important institution for almost all poor immigrants from the global South. Because the state offers virtually no assistance to these individuals, yet at the church you can find someone who speaks your language, you can find very inexpensive child care, so you might be able to find a job, help with your green card application, all these challenges that are facing you. So the church is often an institution, and mosques and synagogues as well. They are institutions and Buddhist temples that play a social and political mediatory role for immigrants that is crucially important.
Thank you. Okay, we're getting the sign that we have to wrap up, but we have, all four of us are going to be hosting workshops after this. So perhaps if you have follow-up questions for one of us in particular, you would want to come to our workshop. So thank you very much again. Thank you to my fellow panelists.